Hello there, everybody. I am John Allen, the editor of Crux, an independent online Catholic news source. You can find us on the web at www.cruxnow.com. That is cruxnow.com. I am also a proud fellow at the Word on Fire Institute of Bishop Robert Barron. Welcome to another episode of The John Allen Show, brought to you by the good people at Word on Fire. Now, what we typically do here in the show is we try to unpack the latest and greatest in Vatican and Pope news, as well as the global church scene and also the domestic scene in the U.S. And this week, that is going to involve some looking back and some looking forward. So looking back, we are going to step through a very busy holiday season for Pope Francis, and as it turns out, a pretty memorable one. Looking forward, we're going to look at what 2020 might bring for this maverick and ever-dynamic pontiff, including some milestone documents that we are expecting to see in the early part of the new year. Okay, so this week actually marks sort of more or less the formal end of the holiday season here at the Vatican. On Monday, Pope Francis celebrated Mass for the Feast of the Epiphany and delivered his traditional noontime Angelus address. Tomorrow, on Thursday, he will give his annual speech to the diplomatic corps, accredited to the Vatican. All but a handful of countries on earth have ambassadors to the Holy See, and they will all be on hand at the Vatican tomorrow to hear the Pope deliver what is widely regarded as his most important foreign policy speech of the year, laying out his social, political, humanitarian, diplomatic priorities for the year. Typically, he surveys the global scene, mentions particular hotspots that he's interested in. Obviously, given the current context, anything he might have to say about tensions between the United States and Iran and the fate of the Middle East will be especially closely watched. You can imagine that those diplomats, after they leave the Sala Clementina, will be scuttling back to their embassies here in Rome to file reports to their foreign ministries, because people are going to be very interested in what the Pope has to say and whether he signals an interest in some kind of role as a mediator or conflict resolver in this, what is, of course, an extremely alarming and precarious situation at the moment following the assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani by U.S. forces. And then on Saturday, we're going to have one of the homiest moments here in the Vatican every year. It will be the Feast of the Baptism of the Lord, and Pope Francis always baptizes the newborn children of Vatican employees. So it's kind of the Pope with his extended family. It takes place in the Sistine Chapel. It's also of liturgical interest because it's the only time all year the Pope celebrates Mass ad orientem, that is, in the traditional posture facing the altar rather than the congregation, because the architecture of the Sistine Chapel requires it. Given his liturgical tastes and philosophy, it's just always interesting to see how he does that. And of course, this caps what has been an extremely active period for the Pope. We had the Christmas Eve liturgy, the Christmas Day Urbi et Orbi address. We had his Angelus for the Feast of St. Stephen the next day. We had the New Year's Eve Vespers and Te Deum, the New Year's Day Mass and Angelus address. But of course, it was an unscripted moment that loomed largest during this holiday season for Pope Francis. It's what I have come to refer to as the Great SWAT of New Year's Eve. This was a moment in which the Pope was grabbed by a sort of overly aggressive pilgrim in St. Peter's Square. Then this woman just wouldn't let go. He was kind of yanked back towards her, sort of lost his cool, swatted her hand a couple of times, got in her face a little bit. That moment was, as you undoubtedly know, captured on video and instantly went viral, generated all kinds of reactions. So we'll unpack that a little bit. And then we will look forward to early 2020 when Pope Francis is expected to release 3 key documents. One, an overhaul, comprehensive reform of the Roman Curia. 2, the Vatican's report on the case of ex-cardinal and now ex-priest Theodore McCarrick. And 3, the Pope's conclusions from the highly contentious Synod of Bishops on the Amazon. Collectively, those 3 documents, each expected to be sort of monumentally important, have suggested to some observers that 2020 could actually be the most important year of Francis's papacy. We shall see. So we're going to unpack all of that. So stick around and we will fill in the blanks.
Hey everybody, it's Jared Zimmer, the director of Bishop Robert Barron's Word on Fire Institute. I hope you're enjoying the John Allen Show, which is yet another production brought to you by the Word on Fire Institute. I wanted to take a few seconds just to invite you to become a member of the Institute, where we offer numerous different aspects that can help form you as an evangelist. Things like courses on theology and philosophy and psychology and sociology. You'll also receive a quarterly journal in the mail throughout the year. Another exclusive offer that we'll be having if you enjoy the John Allen Show is a live Q&A with John, where you can ask questions about the culture, the church, media, etc. So when you join, you also get free access to Word on Fire Digital, which houses all of Bishop Barron's feature films, topical studies, study materials, and the like. So visit wordonfire.institute and come help us proclaim Christ to the culture.
Okay, let's start by looking back at the holidays. You know, in many ways, it is unfortunate that the only thing people are going to remember about the Christmas and New Year season this year is that viral moment on video, the Great Swat, because, you know, there were a lot of other important things along the way. It began, as it always does, with the Pope delivering his annual message to the Roman Curia, that's the central administrative bureaucracy here at the Vatican. Now, under Pope Francis, these speeches have become famous because the Pope typically uses the occasion to invite people in the Roman Curia to a kind of examination of conscience, and that is certainly what he did again this year, emphasizing how service in the Curia should be about mission. It should be about outreach, and, you know, not about the accumulation of power, privilege, status, and so on. Now, those are very familiar themes from Pope Francis, but what makes them relevant this time is that there may be some very important personnel moves that Pope Francis has to make in 2020 in the Roman Curia. He is expected, for instance, to appoint a new prefect of the very powerful Congregation for Bishops. That's the department currently led by Canadian Cardinal Marc Ouellet, which is responsible for recommending new bishops to the Pope all around the world. Now, you know, of course, it is ultimately up to the Pope to decide who becomes a bishop, and he doesn't always follow the congregation's advice, but probably in about 90% of the cases, whoever the top pick is coming from the Congregation for Bishops is who winds up getting the job, and so their role is crucially important in shaping Catholicism's leadership class. Now, in addition, the Pope is also expected to appoint a new prefect for the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, or at least he theoretically could, because Cardinal Luis Ladaria, the Jesuit who currently holds the job, is going to be turning 75, which is the usual age at which officials submit their resignations. Pope is not obligated to make a change there, but it is certainly possible. And so his speech to the Curia this year, therefore, provides us with a kind of window into the Pope's mental checklist in terms of the kind of figures he will be looking for to move into these critically important senior leadership posts. Now, beyond that, we had the Christmas Day Urbi et Orbi address, which is traditionally a moment where the Pope offers a kind of 360-degree review of the global situation. Francis did that again this year, mentioned a number of hotspots he's concerned with, Venezuela, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, for instance. But in particular, the Pope focused on Syria. The ongoing war in Syria has been a concern of his from his election in 2013. And this speech may be a signal that the Vatican is going to ramp up its diplomatic efforts once again in 2020. Obviously, the end game is to press for peace, but in the meantime, they may be active in trying to argue for humanitarian corridors to get relief to civilian populations. That would be of particular importance right now in the province of Idlib in Syria, which is really the last stronghold of the rebel forces currently under ferocious assault by forces loyal to Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, backed, of course, ultimately by Putin and Russia. Now, that brought us to the New Year's window. On New Year's Day, in the Mass the Pope celebrated, he delivered another very important message, this one about the scourge of violence against women around the world. Pope Francis actually argued that the way a woman's body is treated in a given society is an index of its humanity and of its civilization. Now, in the context of the ongoing problem of violence against women, obviously that papal declaration is important. What lent it irony in this context, of course, is that he gave it the day after this episode in which he was in St. Peter's Square outside the Basilica after the Vespers service. And popes always come out into the square after that service because it's the time they get to go see the Presepe. That's the giant nativity set that is set up in the square. And then they always greet the crowd. And there are barriers set up in the square. The Pope walks down this little corridor between the barriers, goes to the right, says hello to some people, veers over to the left, says hello to some people, and sort of zigzags his way through. Now, this incident that got caught on camera involved the Pope being ready to cut over to the other side of the corridor. At that moment, a woman in the crowd reached out, grabbed his hand, wouldn't let go, kind of yanked him back. And the Pope, quite honestly, blew his stack a little bit, came back, swatted her hand a couple of times, and got in her face. Now, I've probably watched this video about 6 or 7 times. I still cannot make out for sure what it was the Pope said to her, but I am reasonably confident it was not Happy New Year. I think it was something a bit more testy than that. And this moment, which then was sort of shot out of a social media cannon and made the rounds of the world, has generated all sorts of reactions. Some people very vigorously defending the Pope, saying, look, this woman was in the wrong and behaving poorly. Others saying, oh, this reveals the Pope's true colors. It shows the short temper beneath this facade of mercy and graciousness and so on. In any event, Pope Francis himself obviously felt bad about it. The next morning, New Year's Day, during his noontime Angelus address, he was talking about God's patient love. And then he said, we all sometimes are tempted to lose our patience, and said, apologized for the poor example he himself had shown the night before. If anything, if there's a takeaway from all of this, it probably should be that this is a reminder that despite their lofty office and despite the sanctity to which they are called, popes, at the end of the day, are still human beings, and we will essentially see them at less than their full best. By the way, this is hardly unprecedented. Those of us who covered John Paul II once in a while saw him lose his cool. We didn't so much see that under Benedict XVI, but we certainly saw him in very introspective and sometimes sorrowful moments. And so there's probably not, I think there's a danger of over-interpreting this. If there is a serious takeaway, perhaps it involves Vatican security. Some people have been very quick to criticize what they would see as the failure of the security team around the Pope to prevent this kind of thing from happening, and that would include the commander of Italy's elite security service, who was actually known only by a code name in this country to protect his identity. He gave several media interviews saying that if somebody should apologize, it shouldn't be the Pope, it should be the head of his security detail. Now, to be honest with you, papal security is a little bit like air traffic control. Nobody notices it when it works, right? You don't pay any attention when the plane lands perfectly safely. You only notice it when the plane crashes. And similarly, we only notice papal security when something goes wrong. But no doubt, the Swiss guards, who are responsible for the Pope's personal security, And the gendarmes, who are responsible for Vatican security, will both be reviewing this tape very carefully to try to see how they can prevent this sort of thing in the future. All right, so that's the looking back portion. Now let's look ahead. Lots on the calendar for Pope Francis in 2020. But let us begin with those documents we mentioned at the top of the show, because each one, depending on what happens, each one of these things is sure to be extremely closely scrutinized, debated, and potentially highly consequential in terms of where the church goes from here. We'll begin with a report on the McCarrick case. On October 6, 2018, the Vatican released a statement saying that Pope Francis had ordered a thorough review of the Vatican archives to find out what the Vatican knew and when it knew it about charges of sexual abuse and misconduct against then Cardinal Theodore McCarrick. And the statement said that that information would be released in due course. Well, we're now almost a year and a half later, but it would seem that that due course moment is just about to arrive. We know that the document has been drafted, that it is being reviewed by higher-ups. It is described as exhaustive, lengthy, highly detailed. Now, one thing that observers caution, however, is that this document is unlikely to contain a smoking gun, that is, absolutely conclusive proof that a particular official in the Vatican had unambiguous and specific knowledge of the charges against McCarrick and then simply covered them up or failed to take action. What is more likely, we are told, is that there will be a number of officials who heard indirect, at times vague reports, maybe red flags were raised for them, who for one reason or another did not follow up, or at least did not follow up in ways that today we would regard as appropriate. And of course, all of this is important in the context of the broader push for accountability with regard to the clerical sexual abuse scandals. Many observers today would say that the Catholic Church has already implemented strong and convincing accountability for the crime of clerical sexual abuse, but it has not yet achieved the same kind of accountability for the cover-up of that crime, failure to act. And the contents of this report, whatever they are certainly going to become key elements in that broader debate, because certainly for American Catholics, that's what most of them want when it comes to McCarrick. They want to know not just what has happened to him personally, but how it was that he was able to rise up the clerical ladder and then remain in power for so long, when there apparently were rumors and concerns being voiced at earlier stages in his career. And so this report will be put under a microscope to see what it tells us on that front, and it could be a catalyst to the creation of further reform measures, not so much for the crime, but for the cover-up. Now, second document we are all waiting for is the apostolic exhortation that Pope Francis is expected to issue, perhaps as early as March, containing his conclusions from the much debated and almost theatrical Synod of Bishops on the Amazon, which took place last October. You will remember that was the synod that brought us the Pachamama. And that's that small figurine, indigenous figurine of a topless pregnant woman that was prominently displayed throughout the synod and variously described as just an indigenous symbol of life and fertility, all the way to a pagan idol that was inappropriate to be used in settings of Catholic worship and reflection, which was at one point these figurines were stolen from a Roman church, thrown into the Tiber River, then they were fished out by the police and restored. And it sort of symbolized the contentiousness of the entire exercise. There are at least three key issues that Pope Francis may, and I emphasize may because it's up to the Pope to decide what to do, but may address in this document. One, the viri probati, that is, tested married men who have families, who are pillars of their communities, who could be ordained as priests as a solution to intense and chronic priest shortages in some parts of the Amazon, especially isolated rural areas that at present might be lucky to see a priest maybe once a year, maybe even less. It's obviously very difficult to have routine pastoral life under those circumstances. Many people believe the Viri Probati could be a solution to that. Others don't buy it. They would say that priestly celibacy is a cornerstone of priestly identity in the Latin or Western Church, shouldn't just be sort of thrown away for motives of expediency. And further, they would say that other Christian denominations in the Amazon that already have married clergy haven't exactly solved this problem either, and so they're skeptical that this will do it. They would say that the promotion of indigenous vocations is actually where the church ought to be putting its energy. In any event, a majority of bishops of the synod endorsed the idea of the Viri Probati. It is now up to the Pope to decide what to do. Should he give approval, it is almost certain to be carefully circumscribed and limited to regions of the Amazon, but many people believe that that's a sort of ruse because they would say this will set a precedent that very quickly could and probably would be applied in other parts of the Catholic world as well. Another issue is women deacons. The bishops of the synod voted to ask Pope Francis to reopen a consideration of women deacons that he had already gone through a couple of years ago in response to a request from an assembly of women religious, nuns. He had created a commission to study the idea of women deacons. It made a report. That report has been sitting on his desk, and to date, nothing has been done. This was part of a broader conversation at the Synod about trying to find new ministries for women that in some ways would simply put a spotlight and kind of raise up what women are already doing, both in the Amazon and other parts of the Catholic world. Will be very interesting to see what Pope Francis does with that. Finally, there was a call at the Synod for consideration of creating a special Amazonian rite of the Mass, drawing on indigenous rituals and concepts and vocabulary to show respect for indigenous cultures, and for trying to make sure that the gospel can be expressed in compelling ways in their language, their argot, their culture. Again, we'll be very interesting to see what happens with that. Safe bet probably that if there is an Amazonian rite of the Mass, the Pachamama is not going to figure in any explicit way in it, but will be interesting to see if perhaps it has a future in some ways as part of an expanded Amazonian mode of Catholic spirituality and worship. All right, now beyond documents, there are other important things on the Pope's docket in 2020. There are, at the moment, no foreign trips officially confirmed by the Vatican for this year, but it has been widely discussed that the Pope might travel once again to Asia. In this case, Indonesia, which, by the way, is the world's largest Muslim nation, and it has a very different mode of Islam than we often associate with the Middle East. This trip could also take him to East Timor, one of the few overwhelmingly Catholic nations in Asia, and also to Malaysia. If that happens, would be a fascinating Asian odyssey for Pope Francis, who, let's remember, once dreamed of being a missionary in Asia, so no doubt there is a particular tug for him about the idea of making this outing. There has also been talk that the Pope might go to Cyprus and Lebanon, although that would likely be conditioned by the broader security situation in the Middle East. Now, in terms of places the Pope has said he would like to go in 2020, but perhaps are a little dicey, he has said he would like to travel to South Sudan in the company of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, the head of the Worldwide Anglican Communion, and that he would also like to go to Iraq. Now, both of these places, of course, are violence-plagued, and in both cases, the security situation may not allow this to happen. But were the Pope to be able to make it, it would be analogous to the trip he took to the Central African Republic in an attempt to promote a resolution of a chronic conflict and sort of embody the spirit of Saint Francis in terms of aspiring to be a peacemaker. One place he probably will not be going in 2020, because he's already said so, is his native Argentina. Since Francis was elected in 2013, there's been a constant drumbeat about when is he going to go home. Remember that John Paul II, when he was elected from Poland, by the end of his pontificate, had made 7 trips home. Francis is still sitting at 0 and has said that he's unlikely to go in 2020 either, even though he'd originally talked about it, because Argentina recently had elections. There is some concern that if the Pope were to go now, it might be seen as a victory lap for the center-left government that prevailed in those elections. Francis is concerned about the trip being politicized, so once again, it has been backburnered. Other things that are on the Pope's docket, we mentioned earlier in the show, he may make some important appointments in the Roman Curia. There are also important bishops' appointments out there. There's a handful of highly influential cardinals in this papacy. He will be turning 75 this year, including Cardinal Christoph Schönborn of Vienna. Now, there's no reason to think the Pope is going to move quickly to replace them, but he could. In the United States, there are 3 important dioceses that are waiting for new appointments. Those are Atlanta, Philadelphia, and St. Louis. And at least regionally, those are all important tone-setting dioceses, and it will be very instructive to see the kind of person Pope Francis appoints to take over those leadership posts. And then finally, there is the matter of the Vatican's ongoing financial reform. This is a project Pope Francis announced to great fanfare when he was elected in 2013. Very quickly, he created a number of new instruments to try to promote that reform, but there is a widely held perception that somewhere along the way, that reform kind of stalled. And recently, the Vatican has once again been mired in embarrassing financial scandal, principally a scandal involving a multi-hundred-million-dollar land deal in London, where the Secretary of State was trying to buy a piece of property. Actually, it's a former Harrods warehouse in the rather posh Chelsea neighborhood of London that is slated for conversion into luxury apartments. And it turned out that they were, well, the accusation is that they were trying to do an end run around protocols in terms of where that money was coming from and reporting the nature of the transaction and so on. Amidst all of this, the Vatican's top anti-money laundering expert, Swiss lawyer René Brühlhart, either resigned or was forced out, depending on who you listen to. He was the head of the Financial Information Authority, and a successor to him, for him, has now been named. Brühlhart was a key figure. He was sort of seen as the Vatican's Mr. Clean Hands, had a sterling reputation internationally, and so his abrupt departure has certainly raised eyebrows. And the Vatican, to some extent, is facing a ticking clock here, because in the early part of 2020, they will face their next evaluation by Moneyval. That is the anti-money laundering agency of the Council of Europe that has been reviewing the Vatican's financial transparency and accountability mechanisms. And that review is extraordinarily important because Moneyval is sort of the gatekeeper for European entities to global white lists, that is, lists of virtuous actors. The Vatican very much wants to be on those lists, and not just for the moral reason that it would signify that they're playing by the rules, but also for the practical reason that if you are not on those white lists, then certain kinds of transactions become either impossible or considerably more expensive because the due diligence cost goes up, insurance costs go up, as people have reason to be concerned about the provenance and paper trail of the money you're trying to move. And so, for all kinds of reasons, that review is very important. Many people think it is not coming at a particularly auspicious moment for the Vatican, with the personnel shakeups and the evolving financial scandals that are going on right now. It may be that Moneyval sort of dresses down the Vatican a little bit and gives them a fairly lengthy to-do list in terms of cleaning up its act. And so it will be critically important to see what Pope Francis and his team do with those recommendations once they have them. All right, in other words, a busy, consequential, and endlessly fascinating 2020 is in store. And here on The John Allen Show, as we always do, we will be here blow by blow, moment by moment, to break it all down for you. Thanks for watching. Please do check out the terrific resources made available to you by the people at Word on Fire and the Word on Fire Institute. Check out Crux, that's cruxnow.com, cruxnow.com, your one-stop shopping destination for the very best in smart, wired, and independent Catholic journalism. Until we see one another again, have a fantastic and blessed time.